The dust of Red Hollow rose in lazy spirals beneath the late afternoon sun, staining everything the color of dried blood. It was 1872, and the small mining town nestled at the base of the Kestrel Mountains had seen better days, when gold still glittered in the creek beds and hope hadn't yet turned to desperation. Now the town was a collection of weathered buildings, populated by hardened miners, weary women, and the occasional outlaw passing through on their way to somewhere less civilized. Clara Mae Dalton stood in the back room of her mother's restaurant, the Copper Kettle, kneading dough with practiced hands. At 23, she had grown accustomed to the weight of stares, some pitying, most mocking, that followed her through the dusty streets. Her body had always been larger than those of the other girls in town, and in a world that valued delicate waists and porcelain features, Clara had learned early that she was invisible to some and a spectacle to others. "Clara, those biscuits ready yet?" her mother called from the front, her voice thin and reedy from years of coughing sickness. "Almost, Mama," Clara called back, wiping flour from her round cheeks. She moved with surprising grace despite her size, her movements efficient and purposeful. The kitchen was her domain, the one place where she felt truly capable, where her worth could be measured in golden crusts and perfectly seasoned stews rather than the circumference of her waist. The bell above the restaurant door chimed, and Clara heard the familiar sneering voices of Silas Brennan and his cronies, young men with more cruelty than sense. Their laughter always had an edge to it, especially when Clara ventured into the dining room. "Looks like the Copper Kettle's got enough copper for 2 establishments," Silas said loudly, and his friends erupted in laughter. Clara knew the joke was about her, as it always was. She blinked back tears, focusing on the dough beneath her palms. Her father had died when she was 12, his body claimed by cholera during an outbreak that had swept through Red Hollow like a biblical plague. Since then, Clara had been the pillar holding up her mother, their business, their entire fragile existence. She had no time for tears, even when they threatened to fall. As evening descended, Clara loaded a basket with fresh bread and the apple tart she'd made that morning. Widow Hannigan, who lived on the outskirts of town near the mountain trail, had placed an order days ago, and Clara had promised to deliver it before sunset. "You sure you want to go alone?" her mother asked, worry creasing her already lined face. "Storm's coming in from the west." Clara glanced out the window at the darkening sky. Purple-black clouds were indeed gathering over the Kestrel Mountains, their peaks disappearing into the gathering gloom. But Widow Hannigan was elderly and alone, and Clara had given her word. "I'll be quick, Mama," Clara assured her, tying her bonnet under her chin. "The trail's not long." But the storm moved faster than Clara had anticipated. Halfway to Widow Hannigan's cabin, the sky opened up with a fury that seemed personal, as if God himself had taken offense. Rain came down in sheets, turning the trail to mud and obscuring the path ahead. Thunder rolled across the mountains like the footsteps of giants, and lightning split the sky with jagged brilliance. Clara stumbled forward, clutching the basket to her chest, her dress soaked through and clinging to her body. She tried to find the trail, but everything looked the same in the deluge, rocks and trees and darkness. Her foot caught on a root, and she fell hard, the basket spilling its contents into the mud. "No, no, no," she whispered, scrambling to gather the ruined food, her hands shaking from cold and fear. She was lost. The realization settled over her like a shroud, and for the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to cry, her tears mixing with the rain. That's when she saw the light. It was faint at first, a warm glow through the trees, flickering like a promise. Clara stumbled toward it, her legs numb and uncooperative, her breath coming in ragged gasps. As she drew closer, she made out the shape of a small cabin, smoke rising from its chimney despite the storm. She pounded on the door with frozen fists. "Please!" she cried. "Please help me!" The door swung open, and Clara found herself staring up, way up, at the largest man she had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his shoulders broad enough to fill the doorframe, his body thick with muscle earned from years of hard mountain living. A beard covered the lower half of his face, dark and wild, and his eyes, gray as storm clouds, regarded her with a mixture of surprise and something else she couldn't name. But it was the scar that held her attention. It ran from his left temple down across his cheek to his jaw, a raised line of white tissue that spoke of violence and pain. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," the man muttered, his voice deep and rough from disuse. "Get inside before you freeze to death." He stepped aside, and Clara stumbled into the cabin, water pooling at her feet. The warmth from the fireplace was almost painful after the cold of the storm, and she began to shiver violently. The man moved with surprising efficiency for someone his size. He pulled a thick blanket from a chest in the corner and draped it over her shoulders, then guided her to a chair by the fire. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions, just set about making tea with the same focused competence Clara herself employed in the kitchen. "Drink," he said, pressing a tin cup into her hands. The tea was bitter, but hot, and Clara drank gratefully, feeling it spread warmth through her chest. "Thank you," she managed, her teeth still chattering. "I was delivering food to Widow Hannigan, and I got lost in the storm." The man grunted, settling into a chair across from her. In the firelight, Clara could see him more clearly. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps in his 50s, with silver threading through his dark hair and beard. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who worked with them daily. He wore simple clothes, rough spun shirt and trousers, both patched but clean. "Storm'll pass by morning," he said, his eyes fixed on the fire rather than her. "You can head back then." "I don't want to impose," Clara began, but he cut her off with a shake of his head. "Ain't an imposition. Mountain's no place to be in weather like this." He paused, then added grudgingly, "Name's Elias Crow." "Clara May Dalton," she replied, managing a small smile. "My mother runs the copper kettle in Red Hollow." Something flickered in Elias's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or memory. "Know the place," he said simply. "Haven't been to town in a long time." The silence that followed was comfortable rather than awkward. Clara found herself studying the cabin. It was sparse but well maintained, with shelves holding books, jars of preserved food, and various tools. A rifle hung above the door, and in the corner stood a wooden bed frame with a straw mattress. It was the home of someone who valued solitude but wasn't slovenly in his isolation. "You live here alone?" Clara asked, then immediately regretted the question. It seemed too personal, too forward. But Elias didn't seem offended. "For near about 15 years now," he said. "Suits me." There was a weight to those words, a history that Clara recognized because she carried her own. She wanted to ask more, but exhaustion was pulling at her, making her eyelids heavy. The warmth of the fire, the safety of the cabin after her terror in the storm, it all combined to make her feel suddenly, overwhelmingly tired. "You can take the bed," Elias said, rising from his chair. "I'll sleep by the fire." "No, I couldn't," Clara protested, but again he cut her off. "Ain't a discussion," he said, not unkindly. "You've had a rough night. Get some rest." Clara was too exhausted to argue further. She moved to the bed, still wrapped in the blanket, and lay down atop the covers, fully clothed. As her eyes drifted shut, she heard Elias settling by the fire, the soft sounds of him banking the coals and arranging his own bedding. Despite being in a strange man's cabin on a remote mountain, Clara felt safer than she had in years. Dawn broke clear and bright, the storm having scrubbed the sky clean. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then memory returned. The storm, the cabin, Elias Crow. She sat up, wincing at her sore muscles, and saw Elias standing at the small stove, his back to her. He moved with the same quiet competence as the night before, and Clara found herself watching him with curiosity. There was something about him, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his size and the violence suggested by his scar. "Morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned, and for just a moment, before his habitual reserve settled back into place, Clara saw surprise in his face, as if he'd forgotten she was there, or perhaps as if he'd hoped she was real and not a dream. "Morning," he replied, gesturing to the table. "Food's about ready." They ate in companionable silence, and Clara was impressed despite herself. The bacon was perfectly crispy, the eggs cooked just right, and the biscuits, while not as good as her own, were still far better than most men could manage. "You're a good cook," she said, and meant it. Elias shrugged, but she thought she detected a hint of pleasure in his eyes. "Had to learn," he said. "Nobody else up here to do it." After breakfast, Clara helped clean up, despite Elias's protests. As they worked, she found herself sneaking glances at him, trying to puzzle out the mystery of this solitary mountain man who had saved her life. "I should get back," she said finally, though she found herself reluctant to leave. "My mother will be worried sick." Elias nodded and retrieved her now dry cloak from where it hung by the fire. "I'll walk you down," he said. "Trail's tricky after a storm." They made their way down the mountain together, Elias moving with the sure-footedness of someone who knew every rock and root. He guided Clara with a gentle hand at her elbow when the path grew steep, never once commenting on her size or her clumsiness. It was such a contrast to the treatment she received in town that Clara found herself growing more and more aware of him with each step. When they reached the outskirts of Red Hollow, Elias stopped. "You'll be all right from here," he said, his eyes scanning the town as if it were enemy territory. "Thank you," Clara said, and she meant it with her whole heart. "You saved my life last night." Elias shook his head. "Mountain's no place for anyone in a storm," he said gruffly. "Just did what needed doing." He turned to go, and Clara felt a sudden, desperate need to say something, anything, to keep him there just a moment longer. "Will I see you again?" she blurted out, then immediately felt her face flush with embarrassment. Elias paused, his back still to her. For a long moment he didn't move, and Clara wished she could take the words back, bury them in the red dust at her feet. But then he turned, and there was something in his eyes, something vulnerable and hopeful and terrified all at once. "Maybe," he said finally, "if you want." "I do?" Clara said, surprised by her own boldness. "I'd like that very much." Elias nodded once, a sharp bob of his head, and then he was gone, disappearing back up the mountain trail like a ghost returning to its haunting. Clara walked back to the copper kettle in a daze, her mother's scolding and tearful embrace washing over her without really registering. Her mind was full of storm-gray eyes and the feeling of being safe for the first time in longer than she could remember. The weeks that followed took on a strange, dreamlike quality for Clara. She found herself thinking about Elias at odd moments, while kneading bread, while serving customers, while lying awake at night listening to her mother's labored breathing. She wondered about his life on the mountain, about the scar that marked his face, about what had driven him to such complete isolation. On the third week after the storm, Clara found herself baking more than the restaurant needed. She made apple tarts and honey cakes, cinnamon rolls and sugar cookies, each batch more elaborate than the last. Her mother commented on it, but Clara just shrugged and said she was experimenting with new recipes. But the truth was that she was building up her courage. Finally, on a Sunday morning when the restaurant was closed, Clara packed a basket with her best baking and set out for the mountain. She told herself it was just to say thank you properly, to repay Elias for his kindness. But her racing heart suggested there was more to it than simple gratitude. The climb was harder in daylight, without fear to drive her forward. By the time she reached the cabin, Clara was sweating and out of breath, her dress sticking to her back. She almost turned around several times, convinced that Elias would think her forward or foolish. But when she finally knocked on the door and Elias opened it, the look of surprised pleasure on his face made every difficult step worth it. "Clara," he said, and the way he said her name, soft and wondering, made something flutter in her chest. "I brought you something," Clara said, holding out the basket. "To thank you, properly." Elias took the basket, lifting the cloth to peer inside. His eyes widened slightly at the array of baked goods, and when he looked back at Clara, there was something almost like awe in his expression. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I wanted to," Clara replied. They stood there for a moment, awkward and uncertain, until Elias finally stepped back and gestured her inside. "Would you like some coffee?" he asked. Clara smiled, feeling some of her nervousness ease. "That would be lovely." They sat by the fire, drinking coffee and eating Clara's cinnamon rolls, and this time the silence was punctuated by conversation. Clara told Elias about life in Red Hollow, about the copper kettle and her mother's illness, about the slow death of the town as the mines played out. She found herself talking more than she usually did, drawn out by Elias's quiet attention and the way he actually seemed to listen. Elias, in turn, shared small pieces of his life, how he hunted and trapped for furs, how he'd built the cabin himself, how he knew every trail and creek in the Kestrel Mountains. He didn't mention his past, and Clara didn't push, sensing that there were wounds there too deep and too painful to probe. When Clara finally left, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks. Elias walked her part of the way down, and at their parting, Clara found herself saying, "I'll come back, if that's all right." Elias nodded, and this time his smile reached his eyes. "I'd like that," he said. And so began a pattern that would continue through the summer and into fall. Every Sunday, Clara would make the climb to Elias's cabin, always with a basket of food, always with her heart beating a little faster than the exertion warranted. They would sit and talk, or sometimes just sit, comfortable in each other's presence in a way that Clara had never experienced before. She began to notice things about Elias, the way his hands, so large and scarred, could be incredibly gentle when he carved wood or mended a broken tool, the way he would sometimes watch her when he thought she wasn't looking, his eyes soft with something she didn't dare name, the way he always made sure she had the most comfortable chair, the best portion of food, as if her comfort mattered more than his own. And Elias began to notice things about Clara, the way she hummed while she worked, soft melodies that made the cabin feel more like a home, the way her whole face lit up when she laughed, transforming her from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful, the way she never flinched from his scar, never stared at it with pity or revulsion, but simply looked at him as if he were a man worth knowing. One evening, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Clara arrived to find a bouquet of wildflowers on the doorstep, tied with a piece of rough twine. She picked them up, their petals still damp with evening dew, and felt tears prick her eyes. Inside, Elias pretended not to notice her reaction, busying himself with the fire, but Clara saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing at her from the corner of his eye. "They're beautiful," Clara said softly. "Thank you." Elias cleared his throat, his face flushing beneath his beard. "Thought you might like them," he mumbled. "Women usually do." That night, as Clara walked home with the flowers carefully cradled in her arms, she allowed herself to hope, just a little, that maybe, possibly, this strange and gentle man might see her as something more than a friend. But doubt crept in with the darkness. She was Clara May Dalton, fat and plain and unremarkable, except for her skill in a kitchen. Why would a man like Elias, strong and capable, and yes, marked by his past but still whole in ways that mattered, want someone like her? He was probably just being kind, just being a good friend. To think otherwise was to invite the kind of heartbreak she'd carefully protected herself against for 23 years. Meanwhile, up in his mountain cabin, Elias stood by the window and watched the distant lights of Red Hollow. He thought about Clara's smile, about the way she made the loneliness of his life feel less like a virtue and more like a mistake. He thought about his past, about Margaret and little Lily, about the Comanche raid that had stolen them from him while he was away on patrol. He thought about how he'd worn the guilt like a hair shirt for 15 years, punishing himself with isolation because he'd failed to protect the people he loved most. But Clara made him want to try again. Clara made him want to believe that maybe he deserved a second chance at something good. The problem was his face, the scar that marked him as violent, as dangerous, as someone mothers would pull their children away from in the street. Clara had never flinched from it, but that was in the privacy of his cabin, in the isolated space where it was just the two of them. How would she react if he courted her properly, if he walked her through town where everyone could see? Would she be ashamed? Would she finally see him the way he saw himself, as a monster wearing a man's skin? So they danced around each other, both too afraid to speak, both leaving small tokens of affection, and hoping the other would understand. It was Clara's mother who finally forced the truth into the open, though not in the way anyone expected. Margaret Dalton had been failing for months, her cough growing worse, her body growing thinner, despite Clara's best efforts to feed her. The doctor said it was consumption, said there was nothing to be done but make her comfortable and wait for the inevitable. On a cold October morning, Margaret called Clara to her bedside. Her breathing was labored, and her skin had taken on the translucent quality of old parchment. "Mama, you should rest," Clara said, taking her mother's hand. But Margaret shook her head. "Need to talk to you," she wheezed, "about that man." Clara felt her stomach drop. "What man, Mama?" "The mountain man," Margaret said, fixing Clara with a surprisingly sharp look. "The one you've been visiting every Sunday." Clara felt heat flood her face. "I didn't think you knew," she whispered. Margaret managed a weak smile. "I'm sick, not stupid," she said, "and I see how you look when you come back. Happy, like you haven't been in years." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. "I'm sorry, Mama," she said. "I know I should be here more, should be helping with the restaurant." "Hush," Margaret interrupted, squeezing Clara's hand with what little strength she had left. "That's not what I want to talk about." She paused, gathering her breath. "I've been a terrible mother to you, Clara May." "No," Clara protested, but Margaret shook her head. "Yes," she insisted. "I let them mock you. I worried about what people thought. I made you feel like you weren't good enough, just as you were." She coughed, a rattling sound that made Clara wince. "But you are good enough, baby. You're more than good enough. And if that man makes you happy, then you should tell him." "It's not like that," Clara said, even as her heart insisted otherwise. "We're just friends." Margaret's look was knowing. "Life's too short for just friends," she said. "Trust me, I know." That night, Clara lay awake and thought about her mother's words. She thought about Elias, about the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, about the wild flowers and the carefully prepared coffee, and the way he always walked her part of the way home, even though it meant an extra hour of hiking for him. Could it be possible? Could he feel the same way she did? The very idea was terrifying. Meanwhile, Elias was having his own reckoning. One evening, as he sat by his fire whittling a piece of cedar, he found himself carving it into the shape of a woman, round and soft, with her hair pulled back and her face turned slightly to the side as if looking at something wonderful. It was Clara, of course. Everything he did these days seemed to come back to Clara. He set down the half-finished carving and stared into the flames, letting himself remember for the first time in years. Margaret had been his first love, a pretty Irish girl with red hair and a laugh like bells. They'd married young, and Lily had come along 2 years later, all dimples and dark curls. For a while, Elias had been happy, genuinely, completely happy. Then came the raid. Elias had been away on patrol chasing reports of Comanche war parties in the area. By the time he'd returned, the homestead was burning, and Margaret and Lily were gone, taken or killed. The evidence wasn't clear. Elias had tracked the raiding party for 3 weeks, driven by grief and rage. He'd found them too, and the fight had been brutal and bloody. That's where he'd gotten the scar. A Comanche knife had opened his face from temple to jaw, and it was only luck and fury that had kept him alive long enough to win the fight. But by the time it was over, there was no sign of Margaret or Lily, and Elias had to accept that they were gone forever. The guilt had been crushing. He'd been the man of the house, the protector, and he'd failed. He'd left his family vulnerable, and they'd paid the price. So he'd left the cavalry, left civilization, and retreated to the mountains where he wouldn't have to see the pity in people's eyes or risk failing anyone ever again. But Clara had changed things. Clara, with her gentle hands and her warm laugh and her complete lack of judgment about his past or his face. Clara made him want things he'd thought he'd buried with his family, things like companionship and affection, and yes, love. The problem was that he had nothing to offer her. He was an old man living in a cabin on a mountain, with nothing but his scars and his guilt for company. What could he possibly give someone like Clara, who was young and vital and deserved so much more than a broken soldier with a ruined face? The thought of her looking at him with pity, or worse, rejection, was almost more than he could bear. So he kept silent, and Clara kept silent, and the autumn deepened toward winter with words unsaid hanging between them like morning frost. It was the outlaws that finally shattered the careful distance Clara and Elias had maintained. The Ketchum gang rode into Red Hollow on a Wednesday afternoon in early November, 6 men on horseback with guns on their hips and meanness in their eyes. They'd been working their way through the small towns along the mountain range, robbing banks and supply stores, leaving destruction in their wake. Red Hollow didn't have a bank anymore. It had closed 2 years earlier when the mine played out. But the Ketchum gang didn't know that, and they weren't the type to take disappointment well. Clara was in the copper kettle when they burst in, her mother resting in the back room. The restaurant was empty, except for old Mr. Hendricks, who spent most afternoons there nursing a cup of coffee and reminiscing about the town's better days. Well, well, the leader of the gang, a tall man with a cruel smile and a scar of his own, this one across his neck, drawled as he surveyed the restaurant. "What do we have here?" Clara felt ice settle in her stomach. She'd heard about the Ketchum gang, about the violence they left in their wake. "We don't have any money," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The restaurant barely makes enough to keep us fed." The leader laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Then I guess we'll just have to take payment another way," he said, his eyes raking over Clara in a way that made her skin crawl. That's when she heard it. A child screamed from outside. Without thinking, Clara ran to the window. One of the gang members had grabbed little Tommy Reeves, the blacksmith's 6-year-old son, and was holding him while Tommy screamed and struggled. "Let him go!" Clara shouted, running for the door. "Clara, no!" Mr. Hendricks tried to stop her, but she was already outside, driven by a fury that overrode her usual timidity. "Put him down!" she demanded, marching up to the man holding Tommy. "He's just a child." The outlaw looked at her with amusement. "And who's gonna make me?" he asked. "You?" Clara didn't think. She just grabbed a piece of firewood from the pile by the restaurant and swung it as hard as she could at the outlaw's head. It connected with a satisfying crack, and the man stumbled, dropping Tommy. "Run!" Clara shouted at the boy, and Tommy took off like a rabbit, disappearing around the corner. But Clara's moment of triumph was short-lived. The outlaw she'd hit recovered quickly, his face twisted with rage, and before she could react, he backhanded her across the face. Clara went down hard, stars exploding across her vision. "Stupid bitch!" the outlaw snarled, drawing his gun. "Gonna teach you a lesson about hitting your betters." Clara closed her eyes, certain she was about to die. The gunshot that rang out wasn't aimed at her. Clara opened her eyes to see the outlaw who'd been about to shoot her stumble backward, a red stain spreading across his chest. He fell, and behind him she saw a figure that made her heart leap and break at the same time. Elias Crow stood in the middle of the street, a rifle in his hands and murder in his eyes. He worked the lever action, chambering another round, and turned to face the rest of the gang. "Anyone else?" he asked, his voice deadly calm. The Ketchum gang leader assessed Elias with cold calculation. "That's Pike you just shot," he said. "He was my brother." "Then you should have raised him better," Elias replied. For a moment the street was silent, except for the wind. Then the gang leader smiled, slow and dangerous. "Kill him," he said to his men. What followed was chaos. The remaining 5 outlaws drew their weapons, and Elias moved with a speed that belied his size, diving behind a horse trough as bullets chewed up the dirt around him. He returned fire, and another outlaw went down, screaming and clutching his leg. The townspeople who'd been hiding in their homes and businesses began to emerge, armed with whatever weapons they had. Mr. Hendricks appeared with an old cavalry pistol, and the blacksmith, Tommy's father, wielded a hammer in each hand and a fury that rivaled Elias's own. The fight was brutal and quick. When the smoke cleared, 2 of the outlaws were dead, 2 were wounded and being restrained by townspeople, and the Ketchum gang leader was on his horse, fleeing toward the mountains with Elias's bullets chasing him. But the victory came at a cost. Elias had been shot. Clara saw the blood spreading across his left side, soaking through his shirt, and something inside her broke. "Elias!" she screamed, running to him as he stumbled and fell to one knee. "I'm all right," he tried to say, but his face was pale and his breathing shallow. "You're not all right, you stubborn fool," Clara sobbed, pressing her hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Why did you do that? Why did you risk yourself?" Elias looked at her, and in his eyes she saw all the things he'd never been able to say. "Couldn't let them hurt you," he said simply. "Rather die than see that." The doctor came, and between him and Clara, they managed to get Elias to the clinic above the general store. The bullet had gone clean through, missing anything vital, but he'd lost a lot of blood, and the risk of infection was high. Clara refused to leave his side. She sat by his bed through the night, holding his hand and praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening that he wouldn't take this man from her. Not now, not when she'd finally found someone who made her feel like she mattered. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, fevered and restless. At one point, deep in the night, he opened his eyes and looked at Clara with such clarity that it took her breath away. "Margaret," he whispered, and Clara felt her heart crack. "No," she said softly. "It's Clara. It's me." Elias blinked, confusion giving way to recognition, and then devastating to sorrow. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry, Clara." "For what?" Clara asked, tears streaming down her face. "For not being whole," Elias said, each word an effort. "For being broken. For not deserving someone like you." And that's when Clara understood. All this time, she'd been so focused on her own inadequacies, her own certainty that she wasn't worthy of love, that she'd missed the fact that Elias felt exactly the same way. They'd been dancing around each other, both convinced they had nothing to offer, both too afraid to risk rejection. "You listen to me, Elias Crow," Clara said fiercely, gripping his hand so tightly she knew it must hurt. You are not broken. You are the bravest, kindest, most decent man I've ever known. You saved my life tonight. You saved that little boy. You saved this whole town. But I couldn't save them, Elias said, and the anguish in his voice made Clara want to gather him up and hold him until all his broken pieces healed. I couldn't save Margaret and Lily. What kind of man? The kind of man who carries that guilt for 15 years, Clara interrupted. The kind of man who punishes himself by living alone on a mountain because he thinks he deserves to suffer. The kind of man who's so determined to protect everyone else that he can't forgive himself for the one time he wasn't there. Elias stared at her, and Clara saw the moment her words hit home. You couldn't have saved them, she said more gently. You were doing your duty. You were where you were supposed to be, and what happened to your family was a tragedy, but it wasn't your fault. She leaned forward, bringing his hand to her cheek. Don't you think they'd want you to be happy? Don't you think they'd want you to live, really live, instead of just existing? A sound escaped Elias, something between a sob and a laugh. When did you get so wise? He asked. When I met a mountain man who taught me that maybe I was worth more than I thought, Clara replied. They sat in silence for a long moment, Elias's thumb stroking gently across the back of Clara's hand. Outside, the town was settling into an uneasy peace, people returning to their homes, trying to process the violence and the unlikely hero who'd emerged from the mountains to save them. Clara, Elias said finally, his voice stronger now, I need to tell you something. You should rest, Clara began, but Elias shook his head. No, he said. I've been quiet too long, made that mistake before, and I won't make it again. He took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in his side. I love you, Clara May Dalton. I think I've loved you since that first night when you showed up at my door like a drowned cat, all brave and scared at the same time. I love the way you hum when you cook, and the way you laugh at my terrible jokes, and the way you look at me like I'm not a monster. Clara felt her breath catch, hope and fear warring in her chest. But I'm an old man, Elias continued, with a face that scares children and a past that weighs on me like stones. I live in a cabin on a mountain with nothing to my name but some furs and a lot of regrets. I got nothing to offer you, Clara, nothing that a woman like you deserves. This was it, Clara realized. This was the moment she'd been both hoping for and dreading. She could protect herself, could laugh it off or change the subject, could preserve the friendship they'd built and never risk the pain of rejection. Or she could be brave. Clara stood up, still holding Elias's hand, and looked him straight in the eye. You don't have to love me, she said, her voice shaking, but determined. I know what I am. I'm fat and plain and nothing special. I know that men like you, good men, brave men, don't fall in love with women like me. So you don't have to say those things just because you feel grateful or obligated or— Too late, Elias interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. Clara stopped, blinking. What? Too late, Elias repeated, and this time there was the ghost of a smile on his lips. I already love you, Clara, have for months now, and I don't think you're plain, and I sure as hell don't love you out of obligation. He tugged gently on her hand, pulling her closer. You're beautiful to me, the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, and brave and kind, and so damn good it makes my chest hurt. But, Clara tried to argue, tried to list all the reasons this couldn't be real, but Elias cut her off again. "No buts," he said firmly. "I'm done letting fear keep me from living. I'm done punishing myself for things I can't change. And I'm damn well done pretending I don't want you in my life every single day for the rest of however long I've got left." Clara felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in her life, they were tears of pure, overwhelming joy. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've loved you for so long, Elias. I just never thought, never believed that you could feel the same way." "Well, believe it," Elias said. And then he was pulling her down for a kiss that was clumsy and perfect and tasted like salt from her tears and blood from his wounded lip and hope for a future neither of them had dared to dream about. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, covering Red Hollow in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new and full of possibility. Elias's recovery took weeks, and Clara spent most of that time at his side. Her mother, in one of her last moments of clarity before the consumption finally claimed her in early December, gave Clara her blessing with a smile and a whispered, "I told you so." Margaret Dalton died peacefully in her sleep, and the whole town turned out for her funeral. Elias stood beside Clara at the graveside, his arm around her shoulders, and when she broke down sobbing, he held her up and let her grieve without trying to fix it or make it better. He just held her, and somehow that was exactly what she needed. After the funeral, Clara and Elias had to have a serious conversation about their future. The copper kettle needed to be sold. Clara couldn't run it alone, and she didn't want to. Her heart had been in the mountains since that first storm, and now that there was nothing keeping her in Red Hollow, she wanted to go home. "Are you sure?" Elias asked, concern creasing his brow. "The cabin's small, and the winters are hard, and—" Clara stopped him with a kiss. "I'm sure," she said. "As long as I'm with you, I don't care where we live." So they sold the restaurant to a young couple from Denver who'd heard that Red Hollow was looking to reinvent itself as a way station for trappers and traders. Clara kept her mother's recipes and a few pieces of furniture that had sentimental value, and everything else was sold or given away. On a cold January morning, Clara and Elias stood before the circuit judge in what passed for Red Hollow's courthouse, really just a room above the general store, and exchanged simple vows. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her larger frame, and Elias had trimmed his beard and wore a new shirt that Clara had made for him. There were no fancy decorations, no elaborate ceremony, just two people promising to love and honor each other for as long as they both lived. The townspeople threw them a party afterward, and for the first time in her life, Clara felt truly celebrated. People who'd ignored her or mocked her for years now came up to congratulate her, to thank Elias for saving the town, to wish them both well. It should have felt validating, but instead, Clara found it a little sad. "They only see me now because of you," she said to Elias later as they prepared to leave for the mountain. Elias shook his head. "They see you now because you stood up to armed outlaws to save a child," he corrected. "They see you because you're brave and strong and too good for this town ever deserved." He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "But I saw you from the beginning, and I'll keep seeing you, Clara, every single day." Life in the mountains was hard, just as Elias had warned, but it was also more fulfilling than Clara had ever imagined. The cabin became a home under her care. She added curtains to the windows, braided rugs for the floor, and filled the shelves with preserves and dried herbs. She cooked elaborate meals that made Elias groan with pleasure, and he showed her how to track game, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to move through the forest without making a sound. They spent the long winter nights by the fire, talking or reading aloud to each other from Elias's collection of books. He told her stories about his time in the cavalry, about places he'd been and things he'd seen. And she told him about her childhood, about her father who died too young, about dreams she'd had and abandoned. Spring came with a riot of wildflowers, and Clara turned a patch of earth near the cabin into a garden. She grew vegetables and herbs, and Elias built her a small greenhouse where she could extend the growing season. They worked side by side, and Clara discovered that physical labor, when done for your own benefit rather than to please others, could be deeply satisfying. In May, Clara discovered she was pregnant. The news hit them both like a thunderbolt. Elias went pale, then red, then pale again, cycling through emotions too quickly for Clara to track. Finally, he pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I thought I'd never—" he started, then stopped, his voice thick with emotion. "After Lily, I never thought I'd have another chance at being a father." "Are you happy?" Clara asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Elias replied, pulling back to cup her face in his hands. "I'm terrified and thrilled and grateful and completely overwhelmed." He kissed her forehead, her nose, her lips. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me this, for giving us this." The pregnancy was difficult. Clara was sick for the first 3 months, could barely keep anything down, and lost weight she really couldn't afford to lose. Elias hovered over her like a mother hen, trying to tempt her with broth and toast, carrying her to bed when she was too tired to walk, rubbing her back when the nausea got too bad. "I'm sorry," Clara said one night after vomiting for the 3rd time that day. "I'm supposed to be taking care of you, not the other way around." "Hush," Elias said, wiping her face with a cool cloth. "Marriage is taking care of each other. Sometimes you'll be strong, sometimes I will. That's how it works." By the 4th month, the sickness eased, and Clara began to bloom. Her body, which she'd always seen as too much, suddenly felt perfect for the task of growing a new life. Elias would rest his hand on her growing belly and marvel at the movement of their child, his eyes bright with wonder. "What if I'm not a good father?" he asked one night, voicing the fear that had been eating at him. "What if I fail this child the way I failed Lily?" Clara took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "You didn't fail Lily," she said firmly. "What happened to her was a tragedy, but it wasn't your fault. And you're going to be an amazing father because you care so much, because you're willing to face your fears instead of running from them." In late November, as the first snows began to fall, Clara went into labor. Elias had arranged for the midwife from Red Hollow to be there, but the baby came faster than expected, and in the end, it was just the 2 of them in the cabin. "I can't do this," Clara sobbed at one point, the pain overwhelming. "Yes, you can," Elias said, his voice steady and sure. "You're the strongest person I know, Clara. You can do anything." And she did. Their son was born just before dawn, his cries filling the cabin with life and hope. He was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a shock of dark hair and eyes that would eventually settle into the same gray as his father's. "What should we name him?" Clara asked, exhausted but euphoric as she held their son. Elias looked at the baby, then at Clara, his eyes shining with tears. "What about Samuel?" he suggested. "It means God has heard." Clara smiled, thinking about all the prayers she'd sent up over the years, all the time she'd begged God to let her be seen, to let her be loved. "Samuel," she agreed, "it's perfect." 5 years passed like a dream. Samuel grew into a sturdy boy with his father's size and his mother's gentle nature. He learned to walk on the mountain trails, to track rabbits with Elias, to help Clara in the garden. Red Hollow slowly died as more and more families moved away, but the Crow family thrived in their isolation. Clara opened a small restaurant in what was left of the town, making the trip down the mountain twice a week to cook for the remaining residents and the occasional travelers passing through. It gave her an outlet for her skills and brought in enough money to make their lives comfortable. And Elias spent those days teaching Samuel how to survive in the wilderness. On quiet evenings, the three of them would sit on the porch Elias had built, watching the sun set over the Kestrel Mountains. Clara would hold Elias's hand. Samuel would chase fireflies in the meadow, and everything would feel impossibly, perfectly right. "Do you ever regret it?" Elias asked one such evening. "Giving up the town, living up here with just us?" Clara turned to look at him, this man who had saved her in more ways than one, and smiled. "Never," she said. "This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." Elias leaned over and kissed her, soft and sweet. "I love you, Clara May Crow," he said. "I love you too," Clara replied. "Always have, always will." And as the stars came out one by one, painting the sky with light, the Crow family sat together and counted their blessings. They had been broken, both of them, marked by life and loss and the cruelty of a world that judged too harshly. But they had found each other in the storm, had chosen love over fear, had built something beautiful from their shared wounds. Some nights, Elias would tell Samuel stories about his grandmother Margaret and his Aunt Lily, keeping their memories alive. And some nights, Clara would tell Samuel about his grandmother Margaret Dalton, about her strength and her love, about how she'd given Clara permission to be happy. But mostly, they focused on the present, on the life they were building together, on the love that grew stronger with each passing day, on the simple joy of being seen and accepted exactly as they were. Years later, when Samuel was grown and starting a family of his own, he would ask his parents about their story, and Clara and Elias would look at each other with the secret smiles of people who had weathered storms together, and they would tell him about a girl who thought she was unlovable and a man who thought he was a monster, and how they had proven each other wrong. "The world will tell you you're not enough," Elias would say to his son, "but the right person will see past all that to who you really are. And when you find that person," Clara would add, "you hold on tight and you don't let go, because that kind of love, the kind that sees you, truly sees you, that's worth more than all the gold in these mountains." Samuel would nod, understanding the truth of it, carrying that wisdom forward into his own life. And up in their cabin on the Kestrel Mountains, as the seasons turned and the years passed, Clara and Elias lived out their days in the peace that comes from being wholly, completely, unconditionally loved. They had found each other in the darkness of a storm, and they had chosen to be each other's light. It was Clara thought on their 10th anniversary as she lay in Elias's arms watching the snow fall outside their window, the happiest ending she could have ever imagined, not because it was perfect, nothing in life ever was, but because it was real, and it was theirs, and it was built on a foundation of acceptance and grace that would last as long as they both drew breath. "You asleep?" Elias murmured, his hand tracing lazy patterns on her back. "No," Clara whispered, "just thinking about how lucky I am." "We're both lucky," Elias corrected, pulling her closer. "Found each other when we both needed it most." Clara smiled into his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "You know what I think," she said. "What's that?" "I think maybe we weren't lucky," Clara said. "I think maybe we were meant to find each other all along, two broken people who could put each other back together." Elias was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he kissed the top of her head and said, "You know what? I think you're right." And in the warmth of their cabin, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built together, Samuel's toys in the corner, Clara's herbs hanging from the rafters, Elias's tools by the door, they fell asleep in each other's arms, safe and loved and home.